Ian McFarlane, welcome to Australian Musician.
Thank you, Greg. It's a pleasure to chat.
Growing up, Ian, was there music in the house? Did Mum and Dad have a record collection?
They did. They had a pretty good record player, and it was a lot of classical mostly. They didn't particularly like show tunes or anything like that. But so yeah, I remember listening to classical to start off with, oddly enough. But then my parents actually did like some pop stuff. My dad loved Dusty Springfield, and I have a lifelong love of Dusty Springfield. And then they actually introduced us, when I remember in primary school, to the Beatles. They said, listen to the music of the Beatles. So they were kind of, not hip, but they were kind of tuned into things like that. And of course, my first love was the Monkees. So they bought us the Monkees' first album. I must have been 6 or 7 or something like that. And it was like, so I used to rush home from school to watch the Monkees. I think the Monkees were my first sort of, manufactured group that I really liked. And so they did encourage us to listen to pop music. So, yeah, that was funny.
Once you had your own money, what sort of albums were you buying? What gigs were you going to?
Right, okay. What was I buying? Well, I was just obsessed initially with top 40 radio. So my teenage years were the 70s, basically. So grew up in the 70s, 1973 to 79, my teenage years. So, of course, I'm going to be influenced by, top 40 radio, Countdown, and then getting into the pubs when in 1978, that was a huge time in Australian music. So initially, just with pocket money, it was bands like Deep Purple and Mark Bolan and T-Rex and David Bowie. I loved all those. And as soon as I got my first part-time job in 1975, I just bought records. So it was records, music magazines, and clothes. So by that sort of stage, 15, 16, I was exploring all the, I'd moved on from the top 40 radio. So it was, obviously Led Zeppelin, and then I discovered bands like King Crimson and Hawkwind. So this is still mid-70s. And of course, if you think of I always think of this as a linear, like a narrative. So top 40 radio, this is my experience in the 70s. Top 40 radio, glam, hard rock, heavy metal, German electronica, punk and new wave. So basically, I didn't just have both kinds of music, I had everything, So that was what I was into. So it really was this massive learning experience. And apart from hearing the obvious bands on top 40 radio and all the big classic English and American bands, Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, Aerosmith, Alice Cooper, any of those groups, I set out on a quest to discover my own particular music that I really liked. So it was when I discovered bands like King Crimson and Budgie and all these underground bands to us that weren't top 40, that was it, And discovering bands like Iggy and the Stooges and the MC5 and Flamin' Groovies pre-punk was a real revelation for me. I bought Iggy and the Stooges' Raw Power in 1976 in Melbourne. I tell people it was just on the record shelves, and they still don't believe it. And that's still my favourite rock album of all time. So, when you're kind of like that 15, 16, when you discover things like this, it's a real revelation. But I got to also mention that it was all the Australian bands that just enthralled me. So at that time, obviously, it was the Countdown bands, Skyhooks, Sherbet, AC/DC, Little River Band, and then, of course, all the other Melbourne and Sydney rock bands. I was just so enthralled with that stuff. And, of course, as soon as I started getting into the pubs, it was the classic pub rock era, Cold Chisel, Split Enz, Midnight Oil, and then the whole Melbourne and Sydney punk scene. So I'd see Boys Next Door and Teenage Radio Stars and Negatives and all those bands that emerged out of that. And I loved the Models, and then moving into, you know, the Hunters and Collectors in the early 80s. So it was that process of just absorbing everything. Because this is, thinking about this, what happened was also when I first, as I said, got my first part-time job and I had lots of, you know, disposable money, I bought heaps of records, but also that was the emergence or the arrival of Juke and Ram magazine, 1975. Perfect time, a perfect time for me. So I bought all them, I devoured them every week or second week for Ram. I would buy my copies and then just read, you know, cover to cover basically. I just read everything I possibly could. Then I started buying some of the American magazines, Circus, Cream, and then the English magazine Sounds. I was buying that, so I was well up onto the whole emergent punk new wave sort of scene into like 77, 78. I remember the very first article in Sounds on the Sex Pistols, and you know, so that was a revelation as well. And I loved all the English punk bands, The Clash, Jam, Susie and the Banshees, Pistols, you know, all those, The Damned, X-Ray Specs. Interestingly enough, I knew lots of guys who were into the punk scene, and actually two of my best mates in high school was Sean Kelly and at the time Colin McGlinchey, who became James Freud. So they went into that whole kind of rock star thing, and I was actually the drummer in our little garage band when we were like 16-year-old kids, and it was called Sabre before they went professional in Teenage Radio Stars. So I was right at that cusp of that arrival of all those groups. So it was just this learning process, and I was just obsessed with music and magazines, and so it was records, magazines, and I started buying books. The books that influenced me the most were the Encyclopedia type books. So there was the Illustrated Encyclopedia of Rock, which was an English publication. I got hold of Lillian Roxon's Rock Encyclopedia, which was just an absolute revelation, and then the Rolling Stone History of Rock and Pop. And so I devoured them, and the thing I realised was that after each entry they would have a discography or an album discography. So I became obsessed with band discographies. So I bought those A to Z notepads, you know, the A4 style notepads, and just started, you know, assiduously writing out band details, lineups, discographies, singles, A's and B sides. You know, I was obsessed with what was the B side of that single and who wrote that song on that album. And when I would buy my records, I would write out every song on the album and the band details and the songwriters. So I was just obsessed with this chronicling all this information. So I just wanted to, you know, amass all this information, because there was a funny thing I remember in high school. I must have been about 14. You know, you talk to your mates about your favourite bands, whether it was Purple or AC/DC or Black Sabbath or whoever, and I mispronounced Ian Gillan's name. I can't remember, I think I said Gillian, and a mate of mine scoffed and said, "Oh, you don't know anything, it's Gillan. And that somehow turned a switch on my head where I thought, if I'm going to be knowledgeable about music, I've got to get the facts right. So I went on this crusade to find out every possible detail I could. So I became obsessed.
How did that turn to actually writing about music?
Well, how did that turn to writing about music? It took me a long time to put the pieces together. So I was reading Juke and Ram, as I said, and Roadrunner also out of Adelaide. So, you know, the Juke writers, you know, there was Chrissy Eliezer, Al Webb, Alan Webster, David Pepperell, Dr. Pepper, Graham Simpson, guys like that. And then the Ram writers, the Ram magazine was such a different style. They were a little bit more gonzo, kind of Hunter S. Thompson-esque, if you want. So it was Anthony O'Grady, Stuart Coobe, Clinton Walker, Frank Brunetti. This is getting into the 80s, and all the women writers like Jenny Brown, J.J. Adams, Annie Burton. So I've been reading all these people, and I knew how to put a story together, a review, and all those sorts of things. And then I went to Swinburne Uni doing an arts degree, and I did media studies, journalism, and sociology. So they all kind of coalesced. And it kind of occurred to me, I'd been writing this information, and then I'd started doing my own reviews, and I thought it took me a long time to kind of twig that you could actually submit stuff to magazines. So after I'd finished my arts degree, I was working just in admin in an office, and I had all these articles that I'd started writing about bands, and I just started sending them into Juke magazine, and all of a sudden, next issue, they started appearing. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. So it took me until I was this is 1984, I started writing for Juke, which is where I met you, and Christy and Graham, and then Byron Smith came in later on, and Debbie and who was the other office girl? Debbie and...
Linda.
Linda, that's right. So it was a great little crew. I'm a bit of a slow learner in that sense. But then all of a sudden I started getting articles printed. So I went down there and introduced myself. I went to the front desk at Davidson Media and the little office there. And Christy came over and said, come in. So, I introduced myself and chatted with him, and Graham was there, and he said, oh, you can do more, So how about this? Review this album or go and see this band. And then it was all of a sudden, fantastic. So, you'd either get the album to review, so you had it free, or you'd get tickets to go, you'd get two tickets to go and see the band that you were reviewing. You'd write the article and get printed, and then you got paid. I mean, it was just a no-brainer. It was like, bang, okay, it finally twigged. And I said to Christy one time early in the piece, I said, how come you're printing these articles? And they said, you're a good writer. Do more of it. And Graham Simpson, in particular, was a real mentor for me. He sat me down and, kind of tweaked a few things and said, start out like this, or do it like this, rearrange it like this. So he was very good in that regard. So I kind of already knew how to write, how to put together pieces because of my journalism studies. I wasn't a journalist or a cadet journalist, but I already had the knowledge, and I could put a few words together, so it just made sense. But Graham and Christy in particular basically just said, this is how you do it. I remember the first time, I started interviewing like the local bands, all the local bands that I'd been seeing, but I remember the first time Graham gave me an assignment to interview an international artist, and it was right in the deep end. It was Mick Fleetwood. So this was I'd only been doing stuff with Juke for a little while, and it was it was just like, wow, how do I deal with that? And Graham was, you'll be right. Just ask these kind of questions, assign put together the article in this way, and it's easy. You'll be right. So I was so nervous, but he was fantastic. It was phoner interviews in those days. So it was lovely, and so it worked out. So interview him, I see the concert, get the record, get paid. It was like I said, it was.
So
it was fantastic.
You're writing for Juke now. How does that then transition into writing books?
Right. Well, that was a long transition. Excuse me. So I did. Or did I bump that? Might have. I wrote for Juke probably for about 10 years as a freelancer. So, but I was still working, you know, like full-time in other things. I'd worked in publishing and that side of thing, different publishing groups. I worked in, ended up working back at Swinburne in the multimedia unit. So I kind of had that background. And then, yes, so I wrote for Juke as freelancer for about 10 years, and then I wrote for Hot Metal magazine because I was really into metal and hard rock and metal. Always had been, even, you know, from the early days, Purple, Led Zeppelin, into, so, you know, kind of this is the late 80s, early 90s, which was a whole, you know, explosion of heavy metal and all that sort of stuff. So that was a lot of fun. I wrote for the Australian Arts Directory for a long time in the 90s. Well, the Australian being a Murdoch paper, irrespective, but the Art Directory was fantastic. So I did a lot of that. How did I get on? Well, because getting back to what I was saying, I had started to amass a lot of this information on my own. You know, I was just documenting bands. I had all the references. I kept all my issues of Juke magazine and Ram and, you know, Rolling Stone and then you know, a whole lot of other magazines. I just kept piles and piles of them. So I had the reference material. I knew how to put together an encyclopedia thing because that was the biggest influence in terms of how you structure the history sort of thing. And I should also mention another guy that I read a lot was Glenn A. Baker, who was the first Australian, probably journalist to do it from the historical perspective. So I really loved what he did. And so this idea kept fermenting in terms of, well, you know, what do I really want to do with this information? And I thought, I've got to do the Encyclopedia of Australian Rock and Pop. So I started, this is probably 95 by this stage. So, you know, I'd made a pretty good career out of as a music journalist, and I'd done other things. I worked at Roadrunner Records as the label manager for a while out of Shock Records. So I had all these diverse backgrounds, and I came up with this concept, and I started putting together these potted histories of what I wanted to write in an A to Z encyclopedia format. So it was a long haul. So I knew how to put together I call them kind of bios, but they're not really strictly bios, they're histories. So I knew how to put that together. I started putting them together. I knew how to compile a discography. I knew how to interview musicians, so I started interviewing musicians. You know, who played bass on that B-side and what was that lineup when you changed in 1976 and so forth and so forth. So I had all this information together. I presented a proposal to Allen and Unwin, and one of their editors, Sophie Cunningham, went, yeah, sure, come along, let's sort it out. And they gave me a publishing deal. So this is 96 by this stage. And then I left work to work on that for 2 years. It took me a year, January to December, to compile the full A to Z. And then there was another 18 months of editing, proofreading, the whole, you know, This is when publishing was, you know, a thing, a proper thing. So I had a style editor, I had a proofreader, and I had, there was one other, style editor, proofreader, and copy editor, I think they called it. So it went through all these processes, and you know, I'll rewrite this little bit, touch that up, change that, and then finally got published in 1999. So yeah, so funnily enough, here's one I prepared earlier. So that was the first edition. That was my baby. This is the hardback cover. And Sophie Cunningham basically said for that year at Allen Unwin's annual, you know, like whatever they do, wrap up for the year, she said this was her winner for the year. So I was absolutely chuffed, and I'm forever grateful to Sophie Cunningham for, you know, taking it on. And Allen and Unwin were fantastic to deal with. the edition sold out, hardcover sold out, then they went to soft cover, that sold out. So, and that's basically what I've built my career on, I guess, since. So that was all through the 2000s. And
so that's been updated?
Yes. So what I did, Greg, in about 2010, there's been changes in Allen and Unwin, and they basically said, look, we're not going to do anything with your manuscript or your rights. The rights revert to you. So I own the rights of this work outright. So I sat on that for another 5 or 6 years. I had done updates because Roger Grierson at Festival did a licensing deal to put it online as their WAMO database in the early 2000s. So that was I think it was a 3 or 5 year contract. I can't remember. So that was online as a database, and then I was continually updating because I'd got to a point where it was like you just had to keep updating this stuff. New bands, Midnight Oil was still doing stuff. It just went on, increased. So in about 2015, 2016, I thought, I'll have to update it. So I'd been working, by that stage, I'd been working for Raven Records, the reissues label, for about 15 years. I'd been doing new projects and licensing and publishing lines and all that stuff for Raven. And then I thought, I've got to do something with this. So I'd updated my database, and then because the rights had reverted to me, I basically redid the whole thing myself. Because I'd had a background also in publishing, I could do the layouts. So I updated the edition. So this is the 2017 edition. I completely revised the format. Completely different from the original format. Some people prefer this because it's a little bit easier to handle, smaller size. But because I'd increased the volume, the word count by about a third. Says here 160 plus new entries. So it was all the bands that had come since. I mean, you'd have to read it to kind of make the thing. So I updated all the existing entries. I had to strip out some of what I'd call static entries that were no longer relevant. And then I just added in all the new bands. So I completely revised it. I did the layouts for the actual text. Then I got a graphic designer to design the cover. With the photos and to do all the layouts with the photos. So they kind of put it into, print ready format with all the files that I'd already set up. So it was funny, I reread through the whole thing. I was able to fix up a few errors that I'd made. I'd been pointed out at various times, you spelt that name wrong. Or no, I didn't leave in October 1976, I left in October 1977, whatever, So I was able to fix up a few of those things. A couple of little clangers I wasn't happy with. I rewrote a few little sections in terms of the wording that I wasn't happy with. So it was like, I guess I built a rod for my own back, I think is the word, or the description. And it was like, just do it, And I had all sorts of help from people. Like it was like, how do I redo it? Jeff Jenkins was really helpful. He was good advice. I got him to do the forward, which was lovely, and I just loved it. I bought a photographic job lot from Tony Mott. So I found a lot of his photos. So it's a mix of colour and black and white photos, predominantly Tony's work.
Just going back to interviewing bands, what are some of the more memorable interviews you've done?
I loved interviewing bands. You can just have such great fun, or it can be pretty tricky sometimes. But I loved all interviewing Aussie bands, whoever they are. I've loved interviewing Ross Wilson. He's always been fantastic. Shane Howard, Tex Perkins, Tim Rogers is always lovely to interview. Any of those guys, they just know how to conduct an interview. They're just so fun. And the important thing is you have to. This is what I always try and say to young writers: is not give them advice, but do your homework, listen to the music, know what you're going to ask, and know what you're talking about. Otherwise, they'll just look at you and go, "Oh, piss off," But I just remember there was a little four-piece Melbourne band called the Wet Ones. These four girls who were just nutty girls, and they were fantastic. And I did an interview with them in an afternoon session once, and look, honestly, I don't think I've ever laughed so much. They were hilarious, these girls. So I wrote that for Juke, and that was fantastic. And so it's always fun to interview bands. Sean from Models is always fun to talk to. Dave Faulkner, Hoodoo Gurus, absolutely fantastic. Lovely, lovely guys. Any of those guys that I interview, they all respond in the sense that it's not like I have a monopoly on it, but they can tell within the first couple of minutes that I know what I'm talking about, and they might, in some cases, they already know me anyway. So it's like, we'll just open up. So you ask the right questions, you talk about the music, whatever. It's the way you conduct yourself. So I've always had a lot of fun. Some of the overseas artists who I've interviewed, which have just been like mind-blowing. Alice Cooper, Joe Perry from Aerosmith, Lane Staley from Alice in Chains. A lot of those kind of guys have been interesting. Lemmy from Motorhead, he was an absolute peach. I mean, not all of them, but most of them being phoner interviews. So, as I mentioned before, Mick Fleetwood from Fleetwood Mac, he was lovely to talk to. I'm not that important that I get to interview the Bruce Springsteens or the Lou Reeds or the Iggy Pops of this world. So I've never done any of those guys. You know what I mean? So it's never been that momentous occasions. But yeah, Lemmy from Motorhead, he was a lot of fun, as I mentioned. All the Australian musicians. So. But I've never had an interview go completely off the rails, like a real train wreck. But I've had some funny ones. I'll relate to you a couple that almost went wrong. One was actually Lemmy, funnily enough. So the first couple of minutes, I'm chatting, and he's very gruff and he's to the point and all that kind of stuff. And you don't muck around with someone like Lemmy. And I must have been a bit nervous and a bit green. And I can't remember what the question was I asked, but it was probably the second or third question I asked. And there was a silence on the line, and he said, "That's a stupid question." And then there was another silence, and I thought, oh no, I've lost him. He's going to hang up on me. But he, to his credit, he said, "Next question, just ask the next question." And he was a peach from that point on. It was like, I just thought, oh no, don't ask stupid questions. Honestly, I can't remember what the stupid question was. But that one nearly came undone. But he was a gem. But I've got another funny one. With the emergence of Zoom in recent years, which is a great, you do a lot of Zoom interviews, and I really love them too. And I got to interview two of my absolute all-time favourite guitarists in one Zoom interview. One in Hawaii, one in Los Angeles, me in Melbourne. Dennis Tech, who's known for Radio Birdman. I've always loved interviewing Dennis, and I've interviewed him about half a dozen times over the years. And also Rob Younger, who I've interviewed many times. He's lovely as well. So they're some of my favourite bands. So, and the other guitarist, he recorded an album with James Williamson, who played with Iggy and the Stooges. And as I mentioned earlier in the piece, still my favourite ever rock album is Raw Power by Iggy and the Stooges. So here I am interviewing two of my favourite guitar players, and I was quite relaxed, you know, you're on the Zoom and you sort of present yourself. And then I thought, we were talking about the record, and of course I wanted to ask James Williamson about Iggy and the Stooges, recording with Iggy and the Stooges. So I started down that track and I thought I'll quiz him about Raw Power, and I just went absolutely blank. I just froze. I lost my mind. I couldn't think of his name. I couldn't think of the song that I was trying to ask him about. And he was looking at me a bit bemused because the interview had gone really well to that point. And I've gone total fanboy, completely blank. It was the weirdest feeling. And to his credit, Dennis Tech goes, "Oh, you mean Death Trip?" And I go, "Right, that's the song." So James goes, "Oh yeah, it was like this," because I wanted to ask him about the tone of his guitar, the chords he played, what it was like being in the band with Iggy. So that one almost went off the rails because I just went total fanboy, just lost it. But it ended up being fine. And it was Dennis Tech who saved my bacon.
Let's talk about the state of music media today. Most of it's online.
Yes.
What are your feelings about the state of music journalism these days?
It's a bit... Yeah. I'm not comfortable with it. I still have faith in the printed word. I've been writing for Rhythms magazine for probably about 20 years, and Brian Wise still, he's the editor of Rhythms magazine. He also does Off the Record on Triple R. He basically still wants to do a print magazine, which is good, but he does have an online component. So I still like a physical magazine as much as reading online. I find that too much writing from, and this is tricky because apart from in recent years, people like, say, I don't know, Joe Roberts or someone like that who worked at The Age for many years, since the heyday of when I was involved on that side of things, there's no writers that grab my attention. There's no, you know, there's no Clinton Walker, there's no Glenn A. Baker anymore. It's all vacuous, it's all news snippets, which is fine to a degree. That's our loss of focus, and I find that really not annoying, but a little bit troubling. I don't have any faith in getting a good story from writers. But having said that, I still also go back to the music magazines. Like I bought just about every issue of Mojo magazine up until about 4 or 5 years ago. And so I love that style of writing, and I guess those English magazines are still going, some of them. So I like that. But yeah, I don't have a lot of faith in the grab bag style, although that can work. You know, here's some news snippets, so you read a little quick piece, and it's just the very nature of it. What also bugs me, this is a big bugbear, because having a background in publishing, I do editing and proofreading, and the level of just dysfunction in language is it just does my head in sometimes. And my wife just says I am such a pedantic arsehole, and I am. I'm a grammar Nazi, you know, and it's like, I just don't get it. There's no, unfortunately, you know, without going into the whole history of it, the newspapers basically reduced their editing and sub-editing processes, and, you know, clangers get through in headings. You know, instead of investigation, it's investigation, and, you know, shit like that. How does that happen? Well, it happens because no one checks this stuff, you know. So I think I still have faith in writing about music. I still have faith in the printed word. I think it's still important that people still write. I don't want young writers not writing about music, because I know what it was like when I was so fanatical about music, and I want young writers to come forward and write authoritative pieces and not just fluff. There is a place for fluff. I mean, you just have to look at 17 magazine from the 60s, or Dolly, or Smash Hits, or whatever. It was a particular style, So that I'm all game for any of that stuff, but there's got to be attention to the detail. And I still write in my publishing website. I have a website, Third Stone Press, which I do a lot of my own articles, and I've dredged up articles. Dredged up, that doesn't sound the right word. I've put online some of my archive material that I've done over the years, and I like long authoritative pieces and long interviews. There are a lot of good online sites where you can find stuff, but it's just the nature of when you read online, you basically just skip through. You're looking for the main points. I do it. So that's pretty much why those sort of grab bag things work. And another thing with I'm talking, this is sound old school, but with the advent of the internet, you've got all those websites like Rate Your Music and Discogs, which give you all the band information, and people, just the regular reader writes reviews, and some of them are crap and some of them are good, but I read anything that I'm interested in, so they're really good. It's what's the nature of there's been a big downturn, but old farts like us are still around. Us guys that have been writing for years are still going, so there must be something. I still find new music that I love. I'm just enthralled at the moment with a Melbourne singer-songwriter called Leah Senior. So I'm into as much stuff as I possibly can, and I still listen to all the old classic stuff, and there's still stuff you can write about. There's some great new younger bands that have come through, but once again, the industry has changed so much in the last 20 years. It was like if you didn't get it right on your first album, you're dumped by the label. Whereas, in the past, it was like 2, 3, 4, 5 albums into your career, and then you have a big seller, and it's like, yeah, record companies put faith in you as a band or an artist now, or since the whole download and whatever. We can't even go into that, but it's changed. It's like if you don't perform immediately, you're just gone. So a lot of those winners from the pop shows completely disappeared. There's no life in that to my mind, but they're all talented people. I'm just not a big fan of. I suppose it's the Triple J kind of recent type of bands. I won't name names, but there's too many bands and artists, Australian artists and bands, in my estimation, where they don't understand the dynamics of a song. Everything's just on one level. There's no dynamics, there's no arrangement, surprises. That's the thing I kind of worry about. But having said that, I can point out that I don't love every artist I've got in this book, but I wrote about them authoritatively as their history, what they achieved, what releases they did, what kind of music it was, that sort of thing. So it's about, for me, if I'm going to include, I don't know how I just don't know how I'm going to do it, but for me to include some of the more up-and-coming artists in the last 5 years, that's what I do. I just write about them as musicians. Like, believe it or not, I'm a huge Kylie Minogue fan. And I wrote quite a lot about her because I do actually like what she's achieved. She's an amazing performer. But I don't know, there's other groups in here that I might not have liked, but I've said, this band achieved this, the sound was this, and put... So what I write about is probably 80% facts, hard facts. You can't argue with facts. Hard facts, and then on top of that is opinion about the music. So, so it might be, if I'm going to write about Baker Boy or any of those, you know, whoever, I've got to be authoritative. So I'm going to sit on it for a little bit longer. I want a younger writer to take this task on and go, right, okay, every modern artist that's not in that bloke's book, I'll write about. So I want a younger writer to do that. So I'll leave that to them, I think. I think I've done this. I've got to tell you one other thing about having written a book like this. It's really weird because a lot of it was my own research, but I read everything I possibly could. So you've got to take information from an article from 1976. You go, you know, okay, that information, that line up, or as so-and-so, as Glenn A. Baker wrote in 1976, and then a quote. So that's where that information comes from. And after the first edition came out, and with the rise of the internet, I've actually had people say to me, how did you write that? How did you research that? Did you find that information on Wikipedia? And I'm like, oh, for fuck's sake, no. I'm a journalist. You actually do your own bloody work. So that drove me nuts. So I don't reference Wikipedia at all. I very rarely ever read anything on Wikipedia, although I know I've been quoted lots of times, which is great. You know, like there's a great one where I describe Michael Hutchence and they basically use the exact quote, which is great. But it references me, but it's got nothing to do with me. That's the weird thing, you know. So if any young writers are up for it, write a book. You could call it the book about all the bands that bloke McFarlane didn't include in his encyclopedia.
Well, Ian, it's been great to catch up. And
thank you.
Thank you for your time.
It's been a gas.